Welcome to the second episode of Talk is Biotech. My name is Guru Singh, and today I am with Viraj Mane, the CSO of Lactiga, a virtual biotech company developing cures and treatments to infectious diseases, including COVID 19. And they are leveraging human breast milk to do just that. So, very innovative approach. Let's find out more about Viraj's story, his company, and much more. Welcome, Viraj. Nice to have you on the show.
Hi, Guru. Good morning. Great to be with you.
Do you want to start with a quick introduction? What do you do and about your journey?
Sure. I'm the co-founder and chief scientific officer of Lactiga. It's a biotech startup. We are developing our patented anti-infective biologic to protect vulnerable patients against a broad spectrum of infections. And as you just mentioned, our current focus is absolutely the current COVID-19 pandemic.
Very cool. So what's the technology behind it? What's unique about it?
We are very unique because we are actually repurposing the global supply of discarded human breast milk. So there's a global network of milk banks. Many of us have heard of blood banks, but there are also milk banks into which breastfeeding mothers who have extra that they don't need for their own breastfeeding child, then donate that to the milk bank. The milk banks can collect those and create a milk product to be given to premature babies or otherwise vulnerable babies who would benefit from the immune protection found in pooled breast milk. But at those milk banks, there's always a percentage of their supply, which can be up to 15%, that they do not use because it doesn't pass their sample inclusion criteria. And if they weren't going to use it anyway, that means they were going to discard it. And that is the fraction that we have requested because we can repurpose that into a polyclonal antibody biologic.
That's very cool. You mentioned there are these banks that can provide this to your company. How many banks like this exist?
There's actually over 700 of them all around the world, about 4 in Canada, about 26 in the US. And we have begun those discussions to share with them our vision, why we think we can create value from something they don't need and that they were going to discard.
Right.
And that has led to signed commitments regarding sourcing supply of milk. And we have executed those agreements in the US and Canada and even the UK.
What's patented here? Do you have unique processing power, like how to extract antibodies from this milk?
Yeah, that's correct. There's 3 broad categories that we could structure our patent claims into. The first and typically most important is the actual composition. And so our core claims are covering that. Then, just as you said, there are the actual processes by which we can extract high quality and stable antibodies. And then there's the novel clinical utility of that product. And so we've touched on all 3 of those in the claims in our issued Canadian patent. We're currently working towards additional issuances in the US, Japan, and the EU.
Sounds great. How did you come up with this idea? What's the story of your startup?
Yeah, it's a great question. As is usually the case, it's really a personal story before it's a technology story.
Right.
And the personal story is I myself a parent. And so when my child was an infant and breastfeeding, as with many parents, you start to stack up frozen pouches of breast milk in your freezer. If mom is producing late at night or at work and she's not using them at the time, so she stores them for later. And so as a parent, but also a scientist, I used to look at these packages or pouches of milk and say, well, these are chock full of antibodies.
Right.
Pediatric literature is very clear on that. What if there was a way to repurpose this using scientific principles of extraction? And so I started looking at the literature about, has that been done for clinical product purposes? Has there been a commercialization strategy around this? That's what I look for. I didn't find that. So in 2017, that put me on the path of saying, I know enough people here in the greater Toronto area that actually have the protein expertise, the virology expertise to test some of the questions that I would like to solve. And if we can create data sets, I felt that could put us on the path to a foundational piece of intellectual property. And so that's exactly what we did from 2017 into 2019.
Very interesting. Your source is natural from discarded materials. So I think that's the innovation. The more supply chain side is really innovative here.
I totally agree. As with most early stage biotech companies, we're focused on the potency, a
Right.
lab scale proof of concept. Are you able to neutralize certain pathogens? But what we wanted to do as a young company is to prove that we're not just thinking about experiments in a lab bench, we're thinking about industrialization,
Right.
commercialization. We decided, let's just start having those phone calls with potential suppliers. And what was interesting was to say, I'm not really a company yet. I'm a guy with a couple of experiments, but let me call these major pharmaceutical vendors and let me just tell them this is the
Right.
vision.
Right.
What if in 2 years or 1 year, if we were ready to talk to a big company like yours, could you help us? How would that look? And they were happy to have those discussions. That was a bit surprising. And here we are with signed letters of support detailing the capacities of these major vendors to support us in very specific stages of the industrialization process.
That's awesome. So, if you compare it with typical drug molecule, can you talk about the journey of this drug molecule? Do you have to do all of that, like discovery stage, preclinical, then you have R&D, clinical? Like, do you have to go through all of that?
So we are very unique compared to a traditional drug compound discovery process. As you just mentioned, the discovery process could be a screen of 10,000 compounds, and then you down select maybe the top 100 or the top 5. And that can take the first couple years of a traditional biotech that's focused on molecular discovery. That's not happening at all for us. And because we intentionally put together a process that allowed us to fully extract the total antibody repertoire of pooled milk samples. And the polyclonality of that resulting product is intentional. That's the point of the product, to be broad spectrum. And so we don't have to worry about down selecting from a larger heterogeneous pool into a more unified product. The whole point is that it is heterogeneous and that it
Right.
the maximum antigen binding diversity of the antibodies, because that's how they naturally exist in breast milk anyway. So to your question, you can think of us as really cutting off the first 2 years of discovery screening that happens in a traditional chemistry biotechnology company. And we're just starting with the API, or at least, doing the proof of concept on the API that, well, if you have a polyclonal product, it should neutralize certain viruses. And that's what we've been able to focus on. We've been able to skip right past the drug screening phase.
Very cool. So how are you doing the POC, proof of concept, in animals?
So we will be quite soon. But what we've completed so far is at the lab scale, so in vitro neutralization studies. We've tested that in 2 different viruses. The first is respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV, which is one of the most frequent causes of the common cold and is so common among humans that basically by the age of 2 years, all people have already had it. And so we started with that. We worked with our collaborator at Sick Kids Hospital here in Toronto, which is the nation's largest pediatric research center. And we demonstrated 85% neutralization of respiratory syncytial virus in an in vitro neutralization model. And that was several months ago. But then in these recent months and throughout the pandemic, we formalized a technology transfer and collaboration relationship with Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City.
So Viraj, I know you guys are shifting your focus towards COVID. What outcomes you are expecting in the next couple of months or years?
Yeah, obviously COVID is on everyone's mind, and we do have to think in the time frame of weeks and months, not years, because of the urgency. And that's definitely what we think at the company. Now, the reason that this is an important opportunity for us and also why we're well positioned is that, as I mentioned, the respiratory treatment vertical was already one of our most active areas prior to the pandemic. And so we realized that by leaning into that program and really refining that to match the anatomy and the virology of COVID-19, we could make sure that we can get this product to market as soon as possible. On the research side, we have had a collaboration with Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, and they've already generated extremely promising neutralization data sets specific to SARS-CoV-2, which is the novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19. And these data indicate that breast milk antibodies that are raised against the COVID-19 virus are able to fully neutralize that virus in the laboratory setting. So that's very promising in terms of our justification to move the program forward.
Very cool. So when are you expecting this product to clinic or market eventually?
Yeah, this is very challenging. It's pretty speculative because we have to complete preclinical studies and then seek approvals and then gain approvals and then ramp up manufacturing. So there's a lot of very complicated stages that would all have to happen before. But if we want to be on the optimistic side, and if we continue working really hard on this problem, I'd like to see us somewhere at that stage in around a year.
Got it. Got it. In terms of scalability, so currently you're relying on natural source. So let's say if you want to create a vaccine drug in the future for millions of patients, do you think relying on natural source is feasible?
Yep.
100%?
The supply question is very interesting. And because there's a network of 700 of these milk banks around the world, and we've already secured supply relationships with milk banks in 3 countries, the US, Canada, and the UK, we certainly have confidence that we can expand and extend those partnerships so that we can increase coverage to literally any region where we can create these relationships.
That's very cool. So are you competing with some other company to obtain this milk?
So we've done an extensive search on both from the company perspective as well as the R&D perspective of who else might be trying to acquire milk to repurpose. So in terms of antibody extraction and reformulation, we're not aware of competitors doing that. So that significantly restricts and minimizes the potential that other competitors are looking for the same starting material.
And with change in your focus, now your focus is more towards COVID. What changes you had to make in your organization in terms of your priorities or like technology development?
Yeah, this is a good time to pivot back to some of our original company development, which was for primary immunodeficiencies or PID. This is a spectrum of conditions where they're immunocompromised, and so they're vulnerable to frequent infections, viral, bacterial, fungal, parasitic. And for some of the conditions we're most interested in, their vulnerabilities are most predominant in the mucosal spaces, meaning the sinuses, airways, lungs, and then the gastrointestinal tract. And the IgA dimeric antibodies that we're extracting are particularly well suited to those compartments. And so prior to the COVID pandemic, and as far back as 2017, we recognized that those patient cohorts would benefit specifically by having a non-invasive respiratory solution as well as a non-invasive oral solution. And now that we're focusing on the COVID respiratory vertical, that's really just repeating and emphasizing the respiratory programming we had already put in place a couple of years ago. So we've been very deliberate to align these new studies with the original program in such a way that as we advance these 2 different programs in parallel, meaning the broad spectrum anti-infective protection for vulnerable patients and the respiratory COVID treatment, they're actually drawing from the same data sets that we are generating with our partners.
And with your current technology, do you plan to expand your focus to other therapeutic areas? For example, Moderna Therapeutics. They have one technology, mRNA technology, and they're focusing on all types of diseases, cancer, vaccine. So their focus is in many different therapeutic areas at one time. So what about your company? Do you see that level of scalability?
Yeah, I think the platform concept is a very important one, and it absolutely applies to our work. And I'll give you some specific examples. So I mentioned that our program was originally built to serve immunodeficient patients. Mm-hmm. And primary immunodeficiency is a category containing a multitude of different disorders. Now, if you add the conditions that we think are particularly well suited to our therapy, that's already figured in the tens of millions of patients worldwide. And this is patients of all ages. So that's the core opportunity. But thinking more broadly, we also recognize that there are many other conditions around the world that can lead to a person being immunocompromised or immunodeficient. And just some of those examples would be HIV and AIDS as an obvious one. The cancer patients, because of the nature of chemotherapy and its effects on their immune cells. And then anyone that has had any kind of organ transplant because they take immunosuppressive medications to prevent organ rejection. And so all of those conditions I just mentioned are all situations where patients may have an enhanced vulnerability to infections. And all of those represent conditions that we can try to target this therapy towards. We can tailor the delivery method so that it suits their vulnerabilities as optimally as possible. And whereas I mentioned tens of millions of patients for that first cohort, expanding it in this way really makes it closer to 200 million patients around the world.
Very cool. So we learned about your company quite a bit, your focus, and how you are helping in this current pandemic. So now let's talk about your professional journey. So how did you end up here as the CSO of Lactiga?
My career path was very nonlinear. I started by getting a PhD in molecular and human genetics at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. And at that time, I loved the research environment and the camaraderie and the ability to test hypotheses. And so that brought me to two additional academic postdoctoral fellowships, one at the US FDA and one at the University of Maryland. But around that time, I realized that the business world and the technology development world really required different skill sets, and that being in the lab was not going to allow me to gain those skill sets. So I was lucky to have opportunities to, exit the ivory tower. And
Hmm.
I realized that creativity and problem solving and being able to do a deep dive, but also take a big picture view on a problem statement, those are very engaging exercises to do for me. And the business environment and the business development arena were actually great places to flex those skill sets in a way that you don't do as often when you're focused on the nuances of performing a laboratory task, which is very in the weeds and very granular.
Right.
So then I assumed that being out in the the white collar business development world and the partnerships arena was the right fit. But about 4 years ago, having thought of the question of how much of this frozen breast milk is there around the world? I saw it in my own freezer when I became a parent, and I knew that this must be available worldwide. As I thought more about that question, I said, well, this is a commercialization opportunity and a business opportunity, but it has to be driven by the science. So what are the scientific questions I would have to answer to convince someone that this is a compelling business case? And that's what brought me back to engaging with scientists and postdocs to actually structure and then manage and execute these studies that actually led us to an issued patent. So here I am now, really having come full circle and being sometimes focused really on the deep nuances of setting up an experimental design, but in the same day, we may be discussing with a pharmaceutical partner or a major investor or a hospital system. So I've returned to being a scientist, and I'm glad about that, but I'm also flexing all the other skills I've built over the years.
Very inspiring. So I used to work at the bench too, and then I started focusing more towards business side of things. So what I learned is when you work at the bench, your focus has to be in boundaries, right? Because you're focusing
Yeah,
on one target,
you have your
one
blinders on.
problem.
Yeah, you just
Right,
need to do what's in front of you.
right. But with business, it's a different mindset sometimes. You are looking at the potential impact, not just solving one problem, but potential impact and what alternatives you have to solve that problem. So it does require some changes and like how you think.
One of the most gratifying parts about running a startup and knowing a little bit about how businesses operate is that once you know what businesses have done, you also know what they haven't done. And
Right,
that's really where I think our opportunity comes from, is that gigantic, well-resourced companies have not approached this repurposing methodology in the way we have. I've been asked why that is. And I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I've never run a major company.
right,
So, but I think the point is they make decisions based on templates and patterns they've seen. And my
right.
perspective was really not as a major business person, but as a scientist with a series of questions based on my curiosity. And everything that we've been working on really stemmed from that curiosity.
For bigger business, it's challenging to walk on unwalked path because they have more to lose. But in early stage, when you are still tinkering, you have more space, bigger playground.
I think one of the most surprising and gratifying parts about starting from the ground up is that, well, there isn't a path, as you just said. So we had to create one. But
Right,
as we defined it enough and really learned to clarify what it could mean for patients, as we started reaching out to researchers, midwives, breastfeeding mothers, and then eventually to investors and milk bank directors, they felt that our concept was plausible and that although they never had that kind of discussion, it was worth
right.
having the discussion and the follow-up discussion. And so we truly did create a pathway. And this was without external funding, so we didn't really have resources to back up what we were proposing to them. It was really just about wondering if we could seem credible to them and if they could believe in what we thought we could accomplish.
So, what challenges you faced in starting your business? I know hundreds of challenges, probably, or if not thousands of, but what are the biggest challenges any bio entrepreneur face while starting the company? Because it's different from creating a consumer tech or a consumer product, right? Because here it's a regulatory controlled environment.
So, unlike
Sure.
the consumer products that you just mentioned, you have to kind of guess that young kids will love your app. I mean, you
Right.
have to make a lot of assumptions. With a
Right.
biotech company, you can formulate a hypothesis and then either support it or reject it. So, it's much more of a binary decision. You know, you can create an effect or have an impact or correct some condition. And at that point, it's no longer as much of an assumption. You're already starting from
Right.
of some certainty, albeit at the preclinical stage. Now, the
Right.
second half of that, which I think is not very native or not very easy for pure scientists to do, is to then say, well, if I could do this in some affordable and sustainable way, would someone or something pay for that? And would they want enough of it for this to make sense?
Right.
So, to your question about what is the biggest challenge, I think defining the opportunity and learning how to capture things like hospitalizations and frequency of infection. How do you convert that into a business opportunity? You know, you have to assign costs to that. Sometimes you have to describe it not as a revenue, but as a cost saving, because you can reduce infections or reduce hospitalization. So learning to speak that language in a credible way was challenging, and it takes a lot of practice.
Currently, you do not have any in-house research capabilities. It's through partners with complementary skills.
That's right. The phrase virtual pharma or virtual biotech
Right.
has been used
Right.
for a couple of years. And I think that really captures us very well because I have really built the fundamentals of this business from the laptop at the table that I'm talking to you on right now.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is my home office. And so we have not had the need to dedicate lab space to us or to hire technicians and students and postdocs, because when you think about the capabilities of the organizations I just mentioned, they are above and beyond in terms of both the equipment and the expertise and the skill sets that I would have wanted in the company. So if we can engage them as partners and collaborators, that frees us from the overhead and the logistics and the salary requirements of trying to replicate all of that in-house.
I think in the future, I have no doubt virtual and semi-virtual biotech will play a leading role inventing new drugs, inventing new life-saving and enhancing products because pharma's productivity is declining. It's well documented. There's more return on investment if you leverage companies with not too much administrative burden and leverage them to really invent something and bring new products to market. Pharma can still play a role of innovation portfolio manager or venture capitalist because they have all the money, they have all the resources. But smaller companies, I won't be surprised if in the next decade or two we see working in networks thousands of, if not tens of thousands of virtual and semi-virtual companies. Maybe after 10 years, if you go to Starbucks, you will see bio entrepreneur managing their R&D programs, launching treatments and cures to major diseases.
I think
That's
this
what
is
goes.
I think this is a great point, and the virtual meeting we're holding right now is so
Yeah,
emblematic of all of us that have been on lockdown. But for us as a company, the truth is this is the same type of productivity I was using before the lockdown. My
right,
meetings were really all virtual anyway. And because our actual research was also virtual, meaning we weren't physically performing it in our own facilities, it really shielded us from some of the restrictions that traditional bricks and mortar businesses would face in a lockdown situation. And I agree with you that what that should mean moving forward is that there's a much more agile approach to collaborating and even executing major transactions between
right.
those startups and the major commercialization partners that lead to that high percentage of biotech sourced approved drugs, as you mentioned. I think that's a model that can reduce costs all around and allow smaller organizations to focus on research, for example, instead of administration and marketing budgets and sales team budgets.
So your potential partners will be probably bigger companies who can manufacture and distribute whenever the technology is ready.
Yeah, I think for practical purposes, that is the way we've been thinking about it, is that we can advance some of our preclinical assets to a stage such as a pre-phase one asset or even a post-phase one asset, which at that point becomes highly attractive as a licensing target for incumbent pharmaceutical companies. So I think that's an extremely logical path for us, especially if one is focused on, 2 to 5 year return on investment. So all
Uh-huh.
of that really covers those early couple years. As a longer term vision, and this is kind of an exciting thing to think about because I've hardly had time to think about the longer term vision, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we may decide there's no need to license attractive assets to external partners. We may decide that we should actually build those in-house. That would require a significant restructuring of the company from a preclinical asset development organization into a much larger functioning company. And I don't pretend to know how to do any of that, but it's a really interesting question to start thinking of. And as we build our own leadership skills and innovation skills, I think it's certainly plausible that our partners will tell us, you guys have a great track record. Why don't you keep building this on
Right,
your own? Like we believe in you and we can support you. And I
right.
think that would be an amazing outcome as well.
To support these later stages, clinical, manufacturing, marketing, post-marketing, can you still remain virtual? Do you see virtual biotech companies will be able to bring product from discovery to market, or they will focus more on out licensing model? If you have to guess, do you think there will be virtual biotech companies managing the development of drug candidate or drugs end to end?
What I've learned over the past couple of years is that there really are an infinite number of ways to engage each other virtually. Now, in the tech space, that's already easier because maybe you're just sharing code or sharing digital assets and logos. But I think much of that, if it hasn't already, can also start bleeding over into the biotech sector. And you use some of the points about having a major sales team or large
Right,
marketing budgets. Well, I've already talked to some of the design firms and the marketing firms that are accustomed to servicing major pharmaceutical companies. And so pharma companies already have virtual engagements with those types of firms to put out new commercials and new product designs. And so I think those are just a few examples of the biotech sector, including major incumbent pharma companies already availing themselves of virtual engagements with firms that specialize in branding, design, marketing.
I think in the future we need more connected environment. So like you do this thing really well, and this party does that thing really well, and how you can collaborate without really too much of a contract negotiation and back and forth. So if all these companies work in strong network and remove all the friction, we will see maybe next Apple in the biotech world coming out of garage or dorm room.
I think it's reasonable to be hopeful for all of that. And
Yeah,
just for myself, as someone who now signs agreements and contracts, a couple times a week, something as simple as the software services that allow you to sign PDFs online instead of having a physical paper that you have to sign on paper and then have it couriered to some recipient, even that friction point has been almost totally removed.
right,
So that just further gives us a reason to execute fairly complex transactions by phone, by email, by signed digital PDFs.
yeah,
There's another aspect of virtualization that we haven't talked about yet and is not specific to biotech, which is that I think it can allow us to regain some of the work-life balance that I think we all strive for. So I have school pickup deadlines, and those are hard deadlines. I'm not available for meetings at those times. But at the
right,
same time, I can choose to be productive from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. if that's what I think will allow me to complete my work. And that it
right,
doesn't matter if that schedule aligns with my colleagues at all, because they can be responsive in their own way, in the timeframes
right,
that work for them. And so we don't have to be bottlenecks for each other. And the end result is we both can improve our work-life balance at the same time. I think that's a
right.
win for everyone involved.
COVID made us realize that we cannot rely on the real world for to perform all of the tasks, like to do research, to meet friends, to meet business partners. So we have to create digital representations of different workflows. you don't have to be in the lab if you just want to monitor what's going on. If you have digital representation of your lab. But currently, I think we do not have all the workflows in the digital environment. So we really have to do a better job creating digital twin, digital replica of all types of workflows, whether it is finding dates or meeting partners or doing research or collaborating with somebody who is buying the license. So we have to do a better job to enable that future.
And I think there's a nice sort of common sense lesson embedded in that, which is, yes, we can assume and depend on, clouds and shared drives to access documents when we want to. But if they're not structured in a logical way, even the person that uploaded all the files won't be able to remember where they are. And so if you're executing a contract with a major institution and they said, we're ready for payment, just send us this form. You can't find the form because you haven't had a file naming convention. That makes sense. So, that, I don't think we'll ever move away from whoever's generating data has to really be thoughtful and deliberate about just structuring information. And that's obviously not specific to biotech, but I see it every time I try to find a document and I think, okay, well, thank goodness I've been using the same date convention on all my file names so I can find something relatively fast.
Right. It's not just about digitizing, it's also like adding more context, connecting different data, right? If you have a data siloed at a different place and things are not connected, if you perform some task but the documents are not connected, there's no point of digitizing.
That's right.
Contextual digitization is needed. One last question is, what advice do you have for bio entrepreneur who is dreaming currently about starting his or her virtual biotech?
It's very cliche. This is not my phrase, but people often say fail fast and fail often, I think is the phrase. And I think that still applies. I mentioned I have a couple issued biotech patents prior to Lactiga, and those represented chances I took on creating technologies. And to have issued patents feels very nice as an achievement, but that is nowhere near a functioning business. It's only one very tiny piece of one. So I think those represent efforts at understanding the technology development side of something without really having spent enough time on the business case and all of those other fundamentals that have to be answered. So the earlier you can take a chance on yourself to create perhaps some intellectual property, even though you didn't think through the business plan, that is such a powerful lesson that you will work much harder on for your second venture and then your third. There are no overnight successes that I know of. There's really just people who have learned from every experience and every failure that they've encountered.
I think we need more bio entrepreneurs like you to solve some of the biggest challenges of this century. I mean it. So it's really inspiring what you are doing, what you have done so far. And I hope there will be more bio entrepreneurs, more courageous people to take a leap of faith and start something of their own and solve problems of this world and make it a better place.
I really thank you for structuring a great discussion. I think we agree that this type of work, it's so challenging, but the type of fulfillment that you feel every day you're heading into work, it's very difficult to match that with a more traditional job working for someone else's large organization. And of course, it has way more risk and heartache.
Right.
Some of those safer career choices. The payoff is very difficult to describe in words.